From a narrow point, a few miles past the lower falls, I beheld the most breathtaking and terrifying view of the canyon. I stretched out on the rocky surface for safety, but the sense of danger still overwhelmed me. As I gazed at the grandeur before me, I felt drowned by my own insignificance, my frailty, my vulnerability, and my puny existence before the overarching scope of nature's prowess. All the more I felt my reliance on that divine omnipotence who constructed these wonders. I could barely manage the fear of the crumbling rock beneath me. My knees quivered, and I nearly fainted, the very dread that blanches men's complexion and wrinkles their faces with horror. Eventually I pulled away from the edge, rejoicing to feel my feet on solid ground and the assurance of my safe return home. The landscape surrounding the canyon and falls, running through both banks of the Yellowstone, is decked out in an array of vivid colors, shades of luxuriant flora. Hillsides, veiled with coniferous pine forests, rise to meet the river. Lush, grassy meadows and flowery shrubs sweep across the ground until they merge with the base of the distant mountains. Those mountains form ridges, peaks, and chains, a spectacular blueness casting itself over the horizon. To add to the grandeur of this panorama, fascinating igneous formations, miraculous hot springs and geysers, billowing columns of hot vapor, mass deposits of sulfur and colossal fossilized stones abound in a profusion that never seems to end. The river teems with trout, while bears, elks, deer, mountain lions, and other smaller animals roam freely through the plains, the forests, and the mountain crevices. The two mighty falls of Yellowstone serve as the perfect conclusion to this awe-inspiring display of natural wonders. They add vibrancy, energy, and majesty to a collection of elements that, without them, would be the most dismal and fearsome void in nature. Their immortal song, reverberating through canyons, mountains, rocks, and forests, thrills your senses, and you marvel at the crowned curtain of fluffy, foamy mist as it crashes into the misty abyss. The stillness that once gripped you as you peered into the dark depths of the canyon below has been shattered by the clamor of water. The terror you once felt has been replaced with wonder and admiration, and the once oppressive scene is now alive with merriment and joy. The upper fall, as we have measured it by crude means, towers at 115 feet. The river reaches the fall via a passage enclosed by rocks that rise 100 feet on either side above its surface. Till about half a mile from the edge of the fall, the river is calm and unruffled, without even a hint of a ripple. Suddenly, and as if sensing the terror that lies ahead, the water surges, forming swirling eddies before plummeting into a series of raging rapids. The rocky walls that confine it slowly close in as the fall comes into view, steering the current by their projections and appearing to push back the water's movement. The water leaps and struggles against its barricade in a wild frenzy, a liquid emerald wreathed with foam, before plunging headlong into the great void below. The great stone sentinels stood tall and proud, their faces 100 feet apart, like guardians of an otherworldly realm. My mind couldn't help but wander, picturing a bridge spanning the gap, and throngs of happy onlookers from all corners of our land gazing in awe. A rocky platform jutted out from the west bank, a quarter of the way between the top and bottom of the waterfall, almost near enough to touch. It was the perfect vantage point, offering a view that could not be surpassed. My companion, Mr. Hedges, and I made our way down to this outcropping of rock, where we settled ourselves for a long while. As we looked up at the thundering cascade, we couldn't help feeling as though the sheer force of the water could sweep us away at any moment. 1,000 gleaming flecks of foam and spray arced towards us, seeming to aim for our very souls. And yet, as we gazed upon the beauty and might of the scene, we felt our fear melt away, replaced by a sense of peace and joy. But despite the glory of this first fall, it could not compare to the grandeur of the one half a mile downstream. Here, the river took another awe-inspiring plunge, throwing itself 320 feet into a cavern of such deep darkness that one could not see the bottom. The stretch of water between the two cataracts was wide and gentle, bordered on either side by towering cliffs. But as it neared the edge, the river narrowed, compressed by the unyielding rock walls, and with a fierce, choked roar it leaped into the void, the sheet of water perfectly formed from top to bottom. It was a sight that no human could fail to be moved by, a testament to the power and majesty of the natural world. and every detail, every nuance of the scene served only to heighten its magnificence. There exists a magnificent harmony in this natural wonder, such that I have never witnessed before in any grand spectacle of nature. It is the fall itself that truly captures the imagination, plunging between the jaws of towering rocks that rise over 600 feet above it, and 900 feet above the deep abyss where it crashes. Long before it reaches its base, the plummeting water is enshrouded in a wafting mist, an ethereal veil that glistens with a rainbow spectrum of color illuminated by the blazing sun. These iridescent hues arch over the cataract in a radiant display of sheer glory. Balanced precariously atop a jutting cliff on the flat crest, I hung suspended above the boiling chasm, facing the tumultuous watery mass. With a trusty cord and a rock I measured its depth, the stone plummeting again and again, the cord snapping thrice before I secured its weight with a sturdy leather band. I am confident that my calculations were exact, the height of the fall a little over 320 feet, and the looming wall that engirdles it 510 feet in height. Peering down from the elevating precipice through the canyon bountifully spread below the cascade, the view is nothing short of breathtaking. For more than a mile, the majestic river cascades downward in a tumbling series of rapid waterfalls, each height different from the other, ranging from 5 to 20 feet in height. It is a tumultuous symphony of raging torrents, frothing and churning as they crash against the hazardously steep canyon walls. Such a sheer drop along the length of the canyon, almost 30 miles, can only be explained by the presence of gargantuan cascades, cliffs with staggering heights, and the turbulence and rapid gradient of the river itself. The rocks in the canyon are shaly, and their hues are painted in a riotous array of yellow, gray, and brown. The rushing water has carved out these fragments of shale into countless whimsical forms, scintillating in the sun's rays that shine down on this natural wonderland. As I stood at the edge of the canyon, I marveled at the power of nature before me. Puffing steam from its sides, the canyon revealed evidence of the thermal springs and volcanic forces that lay beneath its surface. The recession of the river through the canyon was palpable, its ridges marking its sides with distinction. I couldn't help but ponder the possibility that the lower fall, one of many cascading in the abyss, would eventually merge with the upper, creating a titan towering nearly 500 feet high. Few dare to attempt the descent into the Grand Canyon. But Hauser and Stickney did just that, making their way down to a point where the river was over 1,000 feet below the canyon's edge. In an odyssey accompanied only by his orderly, Lieutenant Doane followed the river downstream, wading through its lateral streams until he reached a point where the canyon was a towering 1,500 feet deep. I sat with Mr. Hedges on a table rock opposite the upper fall, soaking in the awe-inspiring milieu. Though we treasured the moment, our time was limited. Clambering up to the top, I lamented leaving behind such an enchanting sight. "A thing of beauty is a joy forever," I quoted, lamenting that I couldn't recall the author. This magnificent display of nature's handiwork left an indelible mark on me. Though concealed in the unspoiled sanctum of the majestic rock formation, the Almighty has crafted some of his most sensational creations here, virtually inaccessible to the masses. Learning how much is unknown when it comes to gazing upon such marvels, I cannot help but marvel at how much surpasses comprehension. This will remain forever etched in my memory, a marvel unlike any other. Thursday, September 1st. We didn't break camp till almost 10 o'clock this morning. The pack train crossed Cascade Creek at its head and joined the river trail about 2 miles up from the upper fall. There's a more direct trail that's 1.5 miles shorter, but it runs along the riverbank. If we hadn't agreed to move on today, I think everyone would have been happy to stay another day at the canyon and falls, except for Jake Smith, that is. The day we arrived at the canyon, after only 30 minutes of looking around, he said, "Well, boys, I've seen all there is to see. I'm ready to move on." We could have stayed longer, but we were starting to run low on supplies, and we didn't know how much longer we'd need to explore. The sun was shining brightly this morning, and its rays brought out the colors of the canyon, brightening the gray and black rock walls. Today was warm, and nature seemed to be urging us to stay longer, but we had to move on. 2 miles above the falls, we crossed a small creek that we named Alum Creek because it's full of alum. 6 miles up from the upper fall, we reached a region with many hot springs and craters. The largest and most noticeable spring is a hot sulfur spring in an oval shape. The water constantly boils and shoots up 3 to 7 feet in the air. The spring is about 12 by 20 feet and has a border of pure sulfur around it, 2 feet wide and extending down to the water's edge. At the time of our visit, the water was 15 to 18 inches below the rim of the spring. This spring resides at the foot of a modest mountain, and the gentle slope that surrounds the spring for 200 to 300 feet is blanketed with a sulfurous residue from the overspill of the spring, ranging from 3 to 10 inches thick. Our soaked path was a dried-up brook, leading from the rim of the spring down into this deposit, demonstrating the recent outflow of the spring. Further down the slope of the mountain, one will find a sulfurous cavern that delves over 20 feet deep and 7 to 8 feet wide at its entrance. Jets of steam explode out of this opening with an echo resembling the sound of a steamboat struggling over a sandbar. The sound is as uniform and robotic as if emitted by a steam engine with much pressure. Hot sulfur vapors come out from hundreds of crevices all over the neighboring mountain from top to bottom, and the crevices of these vapors are cloaked in thick layers of sulfur, some of which are entirely pure. There are some small sulfur springs situated closely that are not particularly remarkable in appearance. About 100 yards from these hot springs is a big hot spring that has an irregular structure, but the water has a deep, muddy hue, around 40 feet long and 25 feet wide on average. Further ahead are about 20 to 30 springs full of boiling mud, with variations in texture and color, and sizes ranging from 2 to 8 feet in diameter. The depth of the mud varies between 3 to 8 feet below the surface, and in most cases the mud's consistency is similar to the plastered mortar, a little runnier, that is. When the mud materializes and is thrown up, it looks like an Indian meal, having bubbles that inflated considerably, ranging from a few inches to almost 2 feet in diameter. In these parts there are springs aplenty, each with a unique character. The mud in these springs varies remarkably. Some are a rich dark brown, others a pale pink, and one stands out in its near-yellow hue. These pools are small, only 4 or 5 feet in diameter, and are spaced no more than 6 feet from each other. They are not linked in any way, whether above or below ground, and the mud in each is a different color. At times there may be as much as 3 feet in difference in the height of the mud, even in neighboring springs. Occasionally there are 2 or more springs that share the same source and pressure, but this is a rarity, and we cannot say for certain that this is always the case. The mud in these springs has been worked over for years and is as soft as the finest pigments. All of these springs are encircled by a single radius that spans 1,000 to 1,200 feet. The entire area appears to be a suffocated crater blanketed with a thick layer sturdy enough to support immense weight. Yet in several instances the ground beneath us gave way under the weight of our horses, and we were forced to dismount. As we examined the area, we observed the crust breaking through in a number of thin places where vapor hissed out. Hidden below the incrustation, the fiercest inferno seems to rage, and the heat seeping through any available crevice or vent is unbearable to the touch, even with a glove on. Deposits of pure sulfur surround these vents, and we were able to break some of these away for later inspection. A small living crater, only 6 inches in diameter, can be found atop the mountain overlooking the large sulfur spring, spewing smoke and hot vapor. There is another crater nearby, adjacent to the mud spring, though its shape is irregular. It covers about 100 square inches, and it also releases hot vapor, causing nearby rocks to alter color with each passing breath of steam. When our horses' hooves struck the incrustation at the foot of the mountain, the sound that reverberated was as though it hit hollow ground. Though some in our group hesitated to traverse the ground with their horses, I believe that with caution exercised in selecting the right path, there is relatively little danger in crossing it. On the great mountain, a plethora of sulfur had formed through the condensation of gas that previously emerged from fissures that are now sealed but were once active in the crusty covering. These crystals have since built up, and we were able to collect many samples of pristine crystallized sulfur. Numerous pounds of sulfur can be found on the peaks and sides of the mountain. These can be easily harvested using a spade to detach them from the incrustation on the mountainsides that it adheres to during condensation. We christened this mountain Crater Hill. As we made our way on, 5 miles down the path, we set up camp in the proximity of the mud geyser. We had traveled through a flat valley for the majority of the day, with the view of this terrain obvious from the peak of Mount Washburn. The river water in this area tasted strongly of the mineral bases found in the springs which bordered our camp and ultimately drained into the river. Friday, September 2nd. Today spent my time marveling at the springs and other natural wonders in this area. Right by our campsite, at the foot of the rolling hills, there are 3 massive springs of bubbling mud, the biggest of which resembles an enormous cauldron. It stretches about 30 feet in diameter and is encircled by a rim several feet wide. From this rim one can stand close to the scorching mud, which boils around 4 or 5 feet below the rim's top. The rim is slightly elevated from the level around it. Around 12 to 15 rods away from this giant mud spring are 2 other springs, varying from 10 to 12 feet in diameter. Near them lies a hot spring of sulfur, which spans 15 to 18 feet in diameter, much too hot to bathe in. After examining these springs, we journeyed up the forested hill upon which they rest. Along the hill's edge and near its peak, under the thriving trees, abundant hot sulfur vapor and steam burst forth from numerous cracks and craters. These natural vents reveal that some of the Earth's hottest fires rage somewhere beneath the surface crust. The crust's hollowness echoes with each step we take over it, signaling the cavernous depths below. Across from the hill, through a small gully, flows a tiny stream of greenish water that arises from a narrow cave, roughly 5 feet in height and width. From the opening of the cavern, the roof slopes downwards at an angle of around 15 degrees. After a distance of 20 feet, the roof touches the top of the water. The bottom of the cavern beneath the water follows a similar angle, but as the water is constantly moving, we are unable to determine the exact angle accurately. The water spurts out in uniform bursts, with each pulse recurring every 10 to 12 seconds. The inside of the cavern and its entrance are blanketed in a dark green layer, which we have gathered for analysis. A further 200 yards away from this location sits another geyser, with eruptions happening every 6 hours. When the opening of the crater is full, it measures approximately 14 feet in width. The sides of the crater are asymmetrical and form a funnel shape, with them sloping down at an angle of about 45 degrees. At the lowest point we saw, the water measured 7 feet across the surface. For several hours, one of our group kept a close watch on the rise of the water. Boiling began when the water neared the halfway point, sometimes exploding with tremendous force. When the basin filled with water to its maximum level, the stream shot upwards with great strength and reached a height ranging from 20 to 30 feet. The width of the column ranged from 7 to 10 feet at the midpoint of the column from top to bottom. The water's shade was a murky gray, and stalagmites created from the geyser's sedimentic deposit covered spots of the crater that had been inundated then come into view. Surveying these wonders, we heard the constant roar of dull, booming sounds that echoed like the reports of distant artillery. Approaching the spot from which the sounds emanated, the ground quaked beneath our feet as if struck by multiple earthquakes. Upon ascending a small hillock, we were bewildered by the extraordinary sight of a mud volcano, the greatest marvel we had yet encountered. Situated at midpoint of a gentle pine-covered slope, the lower side rose to a height of about 35 feet, where a 30-feet-wide crater perched on top. Dense masses of steam explosively surged from the crater, momentarily revealing the contents that regurgitated from a depth of approximately 40 feet. The force and rhythm of the explosions varied between 3 to 8 seconds, and with unvarying regularity, every 5 seconds. The deafening sounds were audible at a distance of half a mile, while the massive jets of vapor that emerged with each explosion were reminiscent of the smoke of burning gunpowder. While some pulsations were more violent than others, each discharge of steam flowed out massively, choking all views of the inside of the crater. Occasionally, during the few seconds between pulsations, or when the breeze carried the steam momentarily to one side of the crater, the interior of the volcano could be glimpsed up to a depth of 30 feet. But it was rare to observe the boiling mud, except when a violent spasm or concussion occurred, throwing a mass of mud, the size of a hogshead, high into the air, emitting blinding clouds of steam in all directions. Our conclusion was that the volcano had recently erupted, bursting forth this summer only a few months ago. The green leaves and branches of the neighboring trees adorned themselves in fresh clay or mud, as did the newly grown grass for at least 180 feet from the crater. We discovered particles of dried mud on the topmost branches of some of the nearby 150 feet high trees, which had fallen during the first outburst, hurling contents of the volcano as high as 250 or 300 feet. Based on the mud particles found on these high trees and the distance they traveled, Mr. Hauser, an experienced engineer with projectile forces, estimated that the mud had been hurled between 300 and 400 feet during the eruption. We confirmed the actual measurement of the mud particles that were found 186 feet from the edge of the crater. We didn't have the nerve to stand on the side of the crater that was sheltered from the wind and endure the pressure of the steam. Mr. Hedges got a little too close to the rim on that side, and by his recklessness he jeopardized his life when he was thrown down the outer side of the crater with tremendous force during one of the terrifying convulsions. General Washburn and I were both frightened after witnessing his fall, and we were concerned that he might tumble into the crater while struggling to find his footing, blinded by the steam and disoriented. Between the volcano, the mud geyser, and the cavern spring lay various hot sulfur and mud springs measuring between 2 and 20 feet in diameter, along with many crevices and openings from which hot vapor or steam escaped, their orifices camouflaged with sulfur deposits or other coatings. We traveled about 4 miles up the valley to our camp by the river, passing several mud puffs on the way from the mud volcano. A soldier brought in a large number of river trout, but the overflow from nearby springs is mixed into the water, making it unpleasant. Some people who drank the water are feeling queasy. Others blame their sickness on the canned peaches, one of the treats in our larder. To quench my thirst, I turned to the peaches instead of the water, and I have not partaken of the water. I must say I am in no better shape than anyone else here. Lieutenant Doan's hand has been driving him to insanity today, the agony etched on his face as clear as day. I could not bear to watch him suffer any longer, and so I offered my assistance with a trusty lancet always tucked away in my pocketbook. But alas, fate seemed to have other plans as I found myself without it, carelessly left behind at home. Undeterred, I made do with the resources at hand, my penknife honed against the supple leather of my saddle as I rode alongside Doan. Thankfully, my seamless sack contained a few simple medicines, including precious chloroform. Doan has finally relented to the idea of allowing me to operate on his felon, but not without the stipulation of being put under. I admit I am a novice in this field, but I am not one to shy away from learning. I have agreed to administer the chloroform if demanded. As we press on higher and higher, the air grows thinner and our surroundings shimmer in a haze. At a height of 7,500 feet, the altitude has yet to take its full effect on us, but I cannot help but feel a sense of weightlessness, my thoughts adrift with the mountains that surround me. Nevertheless, our destination looms ahead, and with it the task that lies ahead, to heal Doan's ailment and assuage his agony. Saturday, September 3rd. This morning, General Washburn and I departed from camp right after enjoying a delicious breakfast. We made our way back 4 miles on the very same path we explored on September 1st, all the way to Crater Hill and the mud springs. Our goal? To conduct further examinations and uncover more discoveries, and that's exactly what we did. After arriving at the spot, we discovered that the sulfur-boiling spring was overflowing with water. The liquid was streaming down the slope of the crust in 2 opposite directions. Moreover, the force of its boiling was stronger than when we last encountered it. Now and then the water would propel up to a height of 10 feet. But that wasn't all. Around 80 to 100 yards away from this boiling spring, we stumbled upon something we hadn't laid eyes on before, a spring of tartaric acid dissolved in water. The perimeter of the spring was brimming with deposits, and we collected a significant amount of it. In the area where we had located a multitude of mud springs previously, we discovered another spring. It was boiling hot and carried a substance with a deep yellow hue. Unfortunately, we couldn't identify the exact nature of the substance, so we decided to gather some of it in a bottle, as we usually do in cases of uncertainty. Once we return home, we'll have it analyzed. While we were in the same basin, we found some samples of black lava. Moving half a mile towards the south from these springs, we discovered an alum spring that produced only a small volume of water. The surrounding crystals were exquisitely beautiful. From the edge of the spring we gathered numerous deposits of alum that had unique shapes and were faintly iron-infused. The water's violent boiling had undermined the border in several places, causing it to peel off suddenly several feet from the edge. It was not safe to stand near the margin. Unfortunately, I did not notice the danger while casually walking beside the spring. However, General Washburn's shout of alarm alerted me to the situation. Quick-witted, I fell back all of a sudden and stretched my whole body out on the crust. With my feet and legs extended above the spring, I rolled away from danger to a secure location. But for the sudden cry of General Washburn, I would have tumbled headfirst into the bubbling pit of alum. We tried to fathom the depth with a pole that measured 25 feet, yet it seemed bottomless. Sulfur lingered in the air, earth, and water. Even the drops we drank were tainted, and each breath we took was thick with the stench of it. Our silver watches suddenly appeared tarnished, like they were made of nothing more than shoddy brass. Today, General Washburn and I returned to the mud volcano. My main objective was to confirm whether the notes in my diary were true or not. They were. I stood transfixed as I watched the ground shudder, and thick plumes of vapor spewed out of the volcano's crater. A sound akin to distant thunder filled our ears. It was so strange, so unfamiliar, that it felt like a mere trick of the mind. But it was not. This natural wonder, which is the most remarkable marvel on this continent full of grand sights, still stands unchallenged amidst the isolated wilderness of Yellowstone, and will leave the thousands who come to witness it awestruck for years to come. On our way back to the camp, we found that the wagon train had already made it across the river. We crossed at the same spot, and on our journey we came across evidence that trappers had once explored this area. We saw that the earth had been cleverly mounded 2 feet high, forming a sharp incline towards the river that was concealed by willows. This made an excellent hiding spot for hunters who could aim unsuspecting birds and creatures without giving away their location. We followed the trail of those who had gone ahead, taking us along the riverbank and through a thick forest of towering pine trees. We traversed a vast, swampy lowland until finally, after a fair distance, we stumbled upon their camp on Yellowstone Lake. The lake was situated 2 miles downstream from where it emptied into the river and roughly 10 miles from our starting point that morning. Brimstone Basin loomed off to our left, and we could make out columns of searing steam rising from the hills beyond. It seemed to us that the Yellowstone River could be crossed at virtually any spot, barring the rapids that run just upstream of the upper fall and the lake itself, if careful attention was paid to potential crevices and the like. Tonight, as we faced Yellowstone Lake from our campsite, I found myself wholly enraptured by the beauty of this body of water. The lake stretched out before us, its shoreline sporting an expansive sandy beach reminiscent of that which lines the ocean waves. This stretch of sand seemed to extend as far as the eye could see, with only rocky outcroppings interrupting its otherwise gentle curves. Furthermore, a bank of sand 8 feet high loomed above us, keeping the water at bay and preventing any overflow from the surrounding area. During times of the year when the snow melts and rivers flood, this natural levee becomes vital in ensuring that everything remains under control. Just a few miles down the shoreline, one could discover examples of sandstone cast in peculiar shapes and sizes. The clay-like material ranged from the size of a walnut to that of a flour barrel, with seemingly no 2 pieces alike. It was evident that fire and water had worked in unison here. Fire deposited the sandstone in its rough form, while water had smoothed and polished the stone until it shone radiantly in the sun. From our campsite we could see a series of islands scattered throughout the lake, all displayed in a seemingly endless line from our viewpoint. 2 of the Tetons, massive mountains that towered in the distance, were clearly visible southward, measuring 25 degrees from our campsite. We would eventually draw closer to these landmarks as our journey around the lake continued. Sunday, September 4th. This morning, Lieutenant Doane was sleeping deeply and snoring loudly as we sat down for breakfast. Rather than wake him, we decided to spend the day in camp and potentially stay until morning. Walter Trumbull suggested we honor Jake Smith's religious beliefs and refrain from traveling on a Sunday. Jake immediately proposed a game of draw to pass the time. Yesterday evening, Lieutenant Doane was experiencing intense pain, and General Washburn and I urged him to undergo an operation to treat the issue. He agreed, but only if I administered chloroform. We set up a makeshift operating table using a box of Army cartridges and enlisted Mr. Bean and Mr. Hedges as assistant surgeons. Hedges was to hold Doane's elbow and watch my movements as I made the incision to prevent any involuntary movement. As we prepared to begin, Doane asked for the chloroform, but my lack of experience administering it made me hesitate. Doane accepted this and instead turned his thumb over on the cartridge box nailed down. With Hedges and Bean holding his arm steady, I quickly inserted the point of my penknife and ripped it out to the end of his thumb. Doane screamed as the pus exploded out on all of us, but then smiled and said, "That was elegant." We applied a poultice of bread and water and refreshed it 30 minutes later. Doane has been sleeping peacefully since then until now, 2 in the afternoon. The evening of September 4th.